world, hello internet, hello people with perhaps an unhealthy interest in pressure groups and political capital. You've come to the right place because that's obviously what we're going to talk about today. Before we do so, we should probably get a few definitions first, and obviously what is political capital seems like a reasonable place to start. We can look at political capital really as clout. You know, what is it that gives you leverage, essentially? And that is leverage born of integrity, credibility, trust, and goodwill. And this can relate to politicians as much as it can relate to people or indeed pressure groups. And when it comes to pressure groups and political capital, we can drill into that a little further, and we can find that it's going to be a function of cash and access and content and membership and strategic importance and the nature of the issue itself, its complexity and its emotional content. So the degree that a pressure group has leverage will essentially be a function of these various different ideas. How much cash it has, the access, blah, 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 blah. We've done that. Okay, so let's move on. The question then becomes, well, what about democracy? How's political capital distributed in a democracy? And generally speaking, it's distributed equitably in that everybody has one vote. Back in the day, you know, women didn't have a vote. We needed property qualifications to have a vote. And indeed, Oxford and Cambridge graduates got more than one vote. Well, we've moved on from that. Whether it's progress or not is kind of moot. But in a democracy, political capital is more or less equitably distributed. We know that there are gaps in the political process, and pressure groups exist largely to plug those. But I'm getting ahead of myself because how do pressure groups affect the distribution of political capital? Well, it comes down to two key ideas here. The first of these is pluralism. And this is the idea that in a properly functioning, hey, you can read it, that's fine. And we can contrast that with elitism, which is this. Now, if I were going to highlight one particular idea here, then it is this idea of a hierarchy. That in an elitist society, we have a hierarchy of political influence with obviously Oxford graduates at the top and people who support West Ham at the bottom. Sorry, headmaster. But, you know, the idea there is that we have a hierarchy of political understanding, clout, and consequently, we have a hierarchy of political influence. That's at least the elitist model. The pluralist model basically says it doesn't matter which football team you support, you should be allowed an equal say in the political functioning of any particular society. So pluralism is all about doing away with hierarchies. Elitism is all about reinforcing hierarchies. However you choose to measure that hierarchy, whether you base it on property qualification or sex or football team, doesn't really matter. Elitism, think hierarchy. Pluralism, think about dismantling hierarchies. And so what we're looking at then is to what extent do pressure groups either establish a hierarchy or reinforce a hierarchy, or do indeed they collapse hierarchies? Now, in terms of pluralism, we can argue that there is a liberal tradition of free expression and free organization. What I mean by that is that anybody can start up a pressure group on almost any subject. You may find that you start a pressure group and it starts to generate a bit of momentum and the government decides, actually, you know what, that's kind of contrary to the rule of law, or it's not, it's inimical to the public interest, and they may legislate you out of existence. But that will always be post hoc. What we find is that if you want to start a pressure group, you can do. There is no qualification process. You don't have to go to the police and ask for permission to start a pressure group. In fact, all you really have to do is to go to 38 degrees. And if you haven't looked at 38 degrees, I suggest you do. Just punch 38 degrees into your web browser and see where you get to. So anyone can start a pressure group, and that is probably a good thing. Not least because these pressure groups can then plug the gaps in the democratic process. Some people are excluded from the democratic process, including, of course, the tyranny of the majority and people excluded by age and by the fact they're in jail. All of these gaps in the democratic process can be plugged by press groups. And don't forget, we've got the fact that geography comes into play when we're looking at democracy, because of course constituencies are drawn along geographical lines, not age lines or functional lines or any of those things. They're drawn along geographic lines. Finally is the idea that press groups exist to inform the debate, and particularly here we're looking at publicizing perspectives and opinions from outside the mainstream. And you could pick any example you wanted here, and I suggest you do. I'm going to give you one from history. I'm going to talk about the Suffragette Movement. Now that of course started off as a pressure group, and when tackling the hierarchy, these positions, the suffragette perspective, the suffragette opinion, was very much from outside the mainstream. Yes, it might have been 50% of the population, but that voice was excluded from mainstream politics, because mainstream politics was essentially a walking, talking manifestation of the patriarchy. So there's one example from history. You need to go and find some more contemporary examples, and we're not short of them. So press groups exist to inform the debate. They exist to plug the gaps in the democratic process, and they're part of a long tradition of free expression and free organization and free association. So in that sense, we can argue that press groups are very much a force for pluralism. Inevitably in politics, we can look at it the other way around. We can say, well, actually what they do is they reinforce elitism. We start from the premise that political capital might be equitably distributed in terms of the vote, but that's where it stops. After that, things get very, very unfair indeed. And we can look at that and say, well, press groups themselves are not necessarily democratic. We have clandestine and closed groups. And here are just three for you to look at. The WSTA, look up that. Also look up the TMA and, of course, ADS. Now, these are all trade groups, well, I don't think it's going to spoil the surprise when these are all what we might call the merchants of death. We've got booze, fags, and weapons. And all of these have their own pressure groups, their own trade associations that seek to advocate the cause of these particular groups. And if you've got time, and I strongly suggest you do, I would suggest you look up a film or a book, if you're into reading, called Thank You for Smoking, which is a really, really fun exercise of what pressure groups do. Thank You for Smoking. It's set in the United States, but it won't do you any harm. It's an absolute giggle. Go and watch it. So, press groups themselves are not necessarily democratic. You can't get into them. You can't gate crash the WSTA party. Well, probably be a good one. You can't really gate crash the TMA unless you're in the business of producing fags. And in terms of aerospace defense and security, well, if you're not manufacturing weapons, don't expect to be invited to their conference. If you're not manufacturing or indeed buying weapons, don't expect to get invited to their particular party. The other problem with press groups and elitism is that they're seeking to articulate but not necessarily to aggregate positions. They're not about finding compromise. In fact, compromise generally is entirely inimical to pressure group agenda. You will very rarely get a pressure group that says, well, obviously we support this, but the other side, they've got a point as well. Maybe they're worth listening to. And what that means is that the other side of the debate is not something in which they're necessarily interested. And if we're talking about reinforcing existing inequitable distributions of political capital, then obviously if all you're ever shouting about is one side of the debate, then you're not really looking at redistributing influence or leverage. And that, I think, is a very particular one when we look at the role of the media. The media, of course, being a very significant thing. If you've got a strong media presence, then that's going to work to your advantage, and you may find yourself in a position whereby you can drown out the opposition. All of which leads us to the biggest single thing here, and that is that pressure groups are not created equal. Whereas in a democracy, everyone gets that one vote. Pressure groups are not created equal, and you could argue that the rise of pressure groups really seeks or really serves only to reward existing concentrations of political capital. In other words, unto those that have, more shall be given. If you've got access, if you've got strategic importance, if you've got buckets of cash, for example, the weapons trade, just to pick one at random, then you are going to have a huge amount of influence. If you can then organize yourselves into a specific group, then all you're going to do is reinforce your particular dominance there. And so we could say, well, look, we've got the cat on the other side, and the cat is all about informing the debate and being a thesis to the anti, or an antithesis to the thesis. That's for the Hegelians out there. But the big problem here is that it doesn't matter how influential, or it doesn't matter how many members or what cash the cat has got. They will never have the same political capital that ADS has, because they're not in the business of defending the state. In fact, some would argue that their very existence undermines the security of the state, and so they will have a different level of political capital, and simply giving power over to pressure groups is going to reinforce that uneven distribution of political capital and distort the debate in one particular direction. Lots of ideas there. The easiest way to sort of reconcile those is to look at this and ask yourself this question: do pressure groups in the UK enhance or undermine democracy? Are they better described as pluralist or elitist? Do they distribute influence or concentrate influence? These are all really the same question, and they all come up in this particular question. And with any luck, I will have said this to you. If I haven't said it, I strongly suggest that you do it now. And that's it. Do it now, and I'll see you in class. Bring your questions. Bring your examples. Again, this is just the bare bones of an argument. These are the points you need to raise. I haven't given you many modern contemporary examples of the sort that really going to generate big marks in the exam. That's your job. Bring them to class, and I'll speak to you then.